He heard the argument before he opened his eyes. Two voices, both men, both familiar, standing maybe 6 feet from his bed, speaking in the clipped, careful way people speak when they think no one important is listening. The board wants a decision before the end of Q1. If Raymond can't demonstrate capacity by February, we move forward with the succession clause. That's 11 weeks. That's generous. Raymond Osei-Bonsu lay completely still. He had been doing that for 2 days now, staying still, keeping his breathing slow and even, listening, not because he had planned it that way. At first, he simply couldn't move. The accident had seen to that. But somewhere in the fog of the first 48 hours, as the morphine thinned and his mind sharpened and the voices around his bed grew less careful, he had made a choice to keep pretending. What he was hearing made him grateful for that choice. 6 days earlier, Raymond had been driving back from a site visit in Barrie. He ran the largest private infrastructure firm in Ontario. Bridges, transit corridors, a water treatment facility currently under construction outside Sudbury. He was 51 years old, built like someone who had once played rugby and still moved like it mattered, and he had not taken a sick day in 4 years. He was not, as his assistant Phoebe Stroud liked to say, the kind of man who stopped. The roads had been clear when he left Barrie. By the time he reached the outskirts of Newmarket, the freezing rain had started. He remembered the truck's taillights going sideways ahead of him. He remembered trying to correct. He remembered, very briefly, the guardrail. Then he remembered nothing until the voices. The first voice he recognized was his business partner of 18 years, Gordon Achterberg. Gordon who had stood at his wedding. Gordon who had been best man when Raymond married Patricia, and who had delivered a speech so warm and funny that Patricia's mother had cried. Gordon, who was currently explaining, in a low and measured voice, that Raymond's 62% stake in Osei-Bonsu Infrastructure, Inc. could be restructured under the incapacity clause in the shareholder agreement. Something Raymond had signed in 2019 without reading carefully enough, during a period when he had trusted people more than he did now. The second voice belonged to his son-in-law, Derek Callahan, Patricia's son from her first marriage, adopted into the family 15 years ago when he was 17. A man Raymond had mentored, promoted, and ultimately handed the Director of Operations title to, because he had believed, genuinely believed, that Derek had earned it. Patricia doesn't have to know the details, Derek was saying. Not yet. We frame it as protecting the company. She'll find out eventually. By then, the restructuring will already be done. Raymond built this thing from nothing. We're not destroying it, we're just securing it. Raymond kept his breathing slow and even. His right hand, the one closest to the wall and furthest from Gordon and Derek, had been able to flex for about 18 hours now. His left side was slower. Something about the impact on the driver's side, a hairline fracture in his shoulder they were still monitoring. But his mind was entirely his own. Had been for at least 36 hours. He had said nothing. He had let them talk. The hospital was St. Michael's, downtown Toronto. He had been moved from the ICU to a private room on the 4th floor once his vitals stabilized. There were flowers from the company on the windowsill. A large formal arrangement that had arrived before Gordon did, which told Raymond something about the order of priorities. The nursing staff changed in the evenings. The day team was efficient and kind in the way of people with too many patients and not enough hours. The night team was smaller. And it was on the third night, somewhere around 11 o'clock, that Raymond first became aware of the man who cleaned his room. He heard him before he saw him, the quiet drag of a cart, the soft compression of rubber wheels on linoleum. The man worked without the overhead light. He used a smaller lamp clipped to the cart, angled toward the floor, so the room stayed mostly dark. Raymond watched him through barely open eyes. He was in his early 40s. Medium height, lean, but with the kind of tired in his shoulders that comes not from the work, but from everything around the work. He moved carefully around the bed, around the monitors, with the practiced attention of someone who had done this long enough that the room's geography was memorized. He didn't speak. He didn't have earbuds in. He just worked quietly in the half-dark. At one point, he paused near the window and looked out at the city for a long moment, not checking his phone, not resting, just looking. And Raymond had the strange thought that this man's was the only person who had entered this room in 3 days without wanting anything from him. The man's name tag read, Aubrey Mensa Cole, Environmental Services. He came back the next night, and the night after that. On the fourth night, something shifted. Raymond had been lying in the dark for hours. Gordon had visited again that afternoon, this time with a lawyer Raymond had never met. A woman named Sandra Fitch, who had asked the attending physician, within Raymond's careful hearing, whether limited responsiveness could be reasonably documented in a formal capacity assessment. The physician, a young resident who looked uncomfortable, had said that wasn't how the process worked. Sandra Fitch had thanked him with a smile and made a note on her legal pad. After they left, Patricia had come. She didn't know about Sandra Fitch. She sat beside Raymond's bed and held his hand and talked about the kids, their 2 daughters, 9 and 12, and about the drive from Oakville, and about how Maisie had drawn him a picture at school and how she'd bring it tomorrow. Patricia talked the way she always did when she was scared. Steadily, filling the silence with ordinary things, as if enough ordinary things stacked together could keep the extraordinary ones at bay. Raymond had wanted very badly to squeeze her hand. He had not. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until he understood the full shape of what Gordon and Derek had set in motion. If he revealed himself too soon, the documentation would be filed before he could respond. He needed a name. He needed to know who else was involved. He needed time. Patricia left at 8. By 11, Raymond was alone in the dark, and the anger had moved through him and left something quieter in its place. Something closer to grief when he heard the cart in the hallway. Aubrey Mensa Cole came in the same way he always did. Lamp on, overhead off, moving carefully around the edges of the room. He cleaned the surfaces near the door first, then the bathroom, then worked his way toward the window. At one point, he knocked a small plastic cup off the edge of the bedside table. It made a soft clatter, and he froze for a moment, glanced at the bed, then bent and picked it up without hurrying. Raymond watched him. Aubrey straightened up, and for a moment he stood very still, and Raymond thought he was going to leave. Instead, Aubrey pulled the chair, the visitor's chair, the one Patricia always used, a few inches from the wall, not close to the bed, just close enough that it wasn't in the middle of the room. He sat down. He didn't look at Raymond. He looked at his own hands, resting in his lap. My wife used to say hospitals at night are the loneliest places in the world, he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried. She was a nurse, so she'd know. She said the hardest part wasn't the sick people. It was the ones who were getting better but hadn't been told yet. They'd just lie there not knowing if it was going to be okay. He was quiet for a moment. She died 2 years ago, ovarian cancer. She was 43. He paused. I still can't get used to saying that sentence. She died. Like it's past tense and that's supposed to make it make sense. Raymond's breathing stayed steady, slow and even. My daughter's name is Ivory. She's 8. She's a good kid. Smarter than me in ways that are already kind of embarrassing. He smiled slightly, looking at his hands. She asked me last month why I still talk to her mom sometimes. I said because I think she can still hear me. Ivory thought about that for a second and said, that makes sense, because sound doesn't stop just because you stop listening. He looked up at the ceiling. 8 years old, he said. I don't know where she gets it. He sat for another minute in the silence. Then he stood, quietly pushed the chair back against the wall and went back to his cart. He was at the door when he stopped. I don't know if you can hear me, he said to the room, but I figure it doesn't hurt to talk. My wife would agree with that. He left. Raymond lay in the dark for a long time afterward, and something that had been very tight in his chest was, if not gone, at least different. Aubrey came every night. He never assumed Raymond was listening. He never performed for him the way Gordon performed, or the way Derek performed when he came and stood at the foot of the bed with that careful, neutral expression. Aubrey just talked, in the low, unhurried way of someone with no agenda, about the things that were on his mind. He talked about Ivory's school. She was doing a project on migratory birds and had decided that Canada geese were personally offensive to her because of an incident at a park in Scarborough that he found deeply funny to recount. He talked about his neighborhood in East York, about his landlord who had finally fixed the heating. After 3 months of requests, about the book he'd been trying to finish for 6 weeks but kept falling asleep reading, because by the time he got home from a late shift, Ivory was already asleep, and it was the only quiet time he had, and quiet time turned out to mean unconscious time. He talked about his wife, Yolanda, said her name carefully, like it was something he was still deciding whether it hurt, about how she used to leave small notes in unexpected places, and how he still found them sometimes, tucked in books or taped to the back of cabinet doors, and how the last one he'd found 6 months after she died was inside the spare umbrella in the front closet, and it said, "You always forget this one. I love you." On the 6th night, he said, "I think you can hear me." He said simply, not as a question, "I think you've been able to hear for a while. I don't know why you're doing it, and I'm not going to pretend it's any of my business." He paused. "But I want you to know that whatever's happening with the people coming in during the day, I can't hear the details from the hallway, but I can hear the tone. And I've worked in hospitals long enough to know the difference between people who come to see someone sick and people who come to manage a situation." He let that settle. "You don't have to do anything with that. I'm just saying it out loud, I guess, because sometimes it helps to hear that somebody noticed." Raymond's eyes were closed. He kept them closed, but his right hand under the blanket had curled into a fist. On the 7th morning, the attending physician, not the resident, but the senior neurologist, Dr. Preethi Nair, came in for her regular assessment. She had been puzzled, she said, by some of the readings. His response indicators were technically in a range consistent with minimally conscious state, but the pattern was irregular. She ran through the standard assessment: light response, verbal response, motor command. "Mr. Osei-Bonsu," she said, "if you can hear me, can you squeeze my hand?" Raymond squeezed her hand. Dr. Nair went very still. "Mr. Osei-Bonsu," she said more carefully, "how long have you been able to respond?" Raymond opened his eyes. The light was sharp, and the ceiling was unfamiliar for one disorienting second before it resolved into the particular shade of institutional white he had been staring at for 7 days. 4 or 5 days, he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "I need to speak with my wife, only my wife, and I need you to tell me exactly who has been asking questions about my capacity assessment." Dr. Nair looked at him for a long moment. "I'll get your wife," she said. Patricia came within the hour. She arrived still in her coat, still holding her car keys, because Raymond had gathered from her voice on the phone that she had not fully believed him until she walked through the door and saw his eyes open and his face turned toward her. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed and put both hands on either side of his face. "How long?" she said. "About 5 days, maybe a bit more." She closed her eyes, opened them. "Why didn't you?" "Gordon," he said, "and Derek." The change in her face was something he would not describe to anyone, ever. It was too private. It was the particular expression of someone understanding 2 things simultaneously: that their husband was okay, and that someone they loved had done something that would take a long time to unknow. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her everything. What happened next took 3 weeks and involved 2 lawyers, 1 forensic accountant, and a very uncomfortable meeting in a boardroom on King Street West. The incapacity clause in the shareholder agreement, the one Sandra Fitch had been preparing to invoke, turned out to be substantially less actionable than Gordon had believed, particularly given that Raymond had been conscious and legally competent during the period in question and could demonstrate as much with Dr. Nair's records and his own testimony. Gordon Achterberg resigned from the board in the second week of February. Derek Callahan's termination came 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a meeting that Raymond conducted himself. He had thought it would feel like something. Mostly it felt like paperwork. Patricia dealt with Derek in her own way, in her own time, in a conversation Raymond was not present for and had not asked about. Whatever she said, he did not contest the termination. The company went through a restructuring, a real one, not the kind Gordon had been planning. Raymond brought in 2 new board members, both people he had known for years and trusted, and he rewrote the shareholder agreement with a lawyer he had found himself, without referrals from anyone currently employed by the firm. He also, in the middle of all of it, called St. Michael's Environmental Services Department. He found Aubrey on a Tuesday evening, coming off a shift. He was in the parking garage, in a winter jacket that was doing its best against the January cold, waiting for the bus that stopped on Bond Street. Raymond pulled up in the company car. The window came down. Aubrey looked at him without surprise. He had probably been told by someone that the patient in room 412 had woken up. He did not seem to know what to do with the fact that the patient in room 412 was currently in a Volvo in the parking garage at 6:10. "Mr. Osei-Bonsu," he said. "Aubrey," Raymond said. "Do you have a few minutes?" They went to a diner on Dundas, one of the places that stay open late and don't ask questions and have coffee that is strong enough to be honest about what it is. Raymond ordered 2 cups, and Aubrey wrapped his hands around his and looked at the table in the way of someone who had spent a lot of time in hospitals and knew that when the patient found you outside the building, it was either very good news or very complicated news. "I heard you," Raymond said. "All of it. From the 3rd night, maybe. Possibly the 2nd. Aubrey nodded once. "I thought so. You kept coming anyway." "Yeah." He looked at his coffee. "I figured you probably had your reasons." "I did." Raymond paused. "What you said about people coming to manage a situation, that helped me. I'm not saying you changed what I did. I would have done the same thing with or without it. But there's a difference between knowing something and hearing someone else say it out loud. Between being alone with it and having someone notice it." Aubrey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife used to say that. She'd say half of what we call healing is just finally having a witness. She sounds like she was remarkable." She was. He said it without the complicated pause he used in the hospital. Just said it. She really was. Raymond set down his cup. "I want to offer you something. And I want to be clear that I'm not doing this because I owe you a debt, or because I'm trying to manage a situation of my own. I'm doing it because you have a daughter who's 8 years old and smarter than either of us, and because your wife worked in healthcare for years, and you've been working nights in that hospital for how long?" 6 years. 6 years. And I run an infrastructure company that is, among other things, starting a major renovation project at a long-term care facility in North York. I need a facilities coordinator, someone who understands how healthcare buildings actually function from the inside, not from the boardroom, from the floor. He paused. "I'm not asking you to do me a favor. I'm asking whether that's something you'd want to think about." Aubrey looked at him for a long time. "I don't want it because you feel like you owe me something," he said. "I know. That's why I said that first." Another silence. Outside, a streetcar went by, throwing orange light across the window. "Can I think about it?" Aubrey said. "Take all the time you want," he called 3 days later. The job started in March. Ivory. Informed of this development with the full diplomatic disclosure that Aubrey seemed to practice with her, announced that she approved. Because the hospital was fine, but the man her dad worked for now had a better parking garage, and there was a Tim Hortons in the lobby. Raymond met her for the first time on a Saturday in late March, when Aubrey brought her to the North York site for a quick visit. She was small and precise in her movements, with her father's careful way of observing things before commenting on them. She shook Raymond's hand with the seriousness of someone who had been told this was what you did when you met people. "My dad says you were pretending to be asleep," she said. Raymond glanced at Aubrey, who had the expression of a man who had tried to simplify the situation and was now regretting it. "Something like that," Raymond said. Ivory considered this. Like a spy? More like someone who needed more information before he could act. She thought about it. "That's basically what a spy does." "Fair enough," Raymond said. She seemed satisfied with this. She asked, after a moment, whether the construction machines were the kind that could excavate or only the kind that moved things around. And when Raymond said both, she asked if she could see the excavator. And Raymond said yes. And that was more or less that. In May, Raymond established a workplace support fund through the company, formally called the Yolanda Mensa Cole Memorial Bursary, with Aubrey's full and deliberate blessing. Its stated purpose was to support continuing education and emergency hardship relief for healthcare support workers in Ontario. The first bursary applications opened in June. Phoebe Stroud, his assistant, who had worked for Raymond for 11 years and was therefore unimpressible, looked at the paperwork and said, "This is the first company initiative you've ever named after a person." "Yes," Raymond said. "Is there a story there?" "There is." She waited. "A woman who worked the night shift in a hospital," he said, "figured out that what people need, more than almost anything else, is to feel like someone noticed them. She never met me. But her husband passed that on in a parking garage in November to a man lying in the dark who needed to hear it." Phoebe looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make sure the press release mentions the night shift." "Good," Raymond said. "That's exactly what it should mention." He still drives carefully in freezing rain. He does not, as Patricia has noted, talk about the accident very much. Not in the way people expect. Not with the dramatic weight of a near miss. When people ask, he says it was bad and it wasn't, which is both things, depending on what you count. What he counts is this: 7 nights in the dark with a man who came in without a motive and left without asking for anything. A daughter who explained to him that sound doesn't stop just because you stop listening. A wife who still leaves notes in places her husband hasn't found yet, because she understood, long before the rest of them, that presence doesn't always require a body in the room. And somewhere in the January dark of a hospital corridor, a woman named Yolanda Mensa Cole, who died too young and was loved well, and who a man who never met her still talks about with something steady and clear in his voice, was the reason a stranger kept coming back to a room where no one had asked him to stay. She would have said that was enough. She would have said that was more than enough. She would have been right.